For today's decade-old hot take, if you ever thought that the Capra Demon fight in Dark Souls wasn't fair, I believe you might have not understood what the game was expecting of you, or you were possibly even misled by the discourse surrounding it. Why do I feel this way? It's because this fight is great at rewarding experimentation, and I'll go so far as to say that it might actually be one of their best puzzle fights. I do still have some criticisms, but I suspect that my suggested fixes are a lot more specific and perhaps weirder than most anyone else's who wishes it was different. But more on all of this in a moment. Allow me to first take a step back and start from the beginning. I have to admit to having a growing appreciation of the Capra Demon. Mind you, I'm not someone who ever really hated it. It's more that I went from being a Capra Demon agnostic to a Capra Demon believer over the years. In my first playthrough way back in 2011, I kind of forgot about the locked door on the Hellkite Bridge and got sidetracked for a while. So by the time I finally made my way there, I was a bit overpowered. I figured out how getting up the stairs made things safer pretty quickly, and I have to recognize that being overleveled stacked things in my favor, allowing me to learn the essentials of the fight with a lot less trouble than most players. And for subsequent runs where I wasn't overpowered, I at least felt somewhat empowered by my understanding of how to use the environment to my advantage. I respect that this is not how it went down for everyone. A lot of people hate this encounter, and I understand where those frustrations are coming from.
Yo, this sucks, dude.
But even if I can't totally change your mind on the Capra Demon today, I at least want to highlight something that it does very well, which in my opinion isn't recognized enough. Okay, so rewarding experimentation. Why is the fight so good at this? We should start by recognizing this fight as what a lot of players will call a gimmick or puzzle fight. Rather than feeling like a well-refined fight that's going to test your skills over the next several minutes, the central gimmick to winning this encounter is simply surviving the first 10 seconds and luring the dogs away so you don't have to fight and dodge everything at once. It's not that the combat with the Capra Demon itself is particularly challenging or engaging. This isn't Artorias, or mostly any Elden Ring boss. There's a specific problem to solve, and that's what makes this encounter what it is. So I feel like the Capra Demon belongs in the pantheon of Souls puzzle fights, which has some perhaps not so esteemed company with the likes of the Bed of Chaos, Dragon God, Yorm, the Royal Rat Vanguard, etc. So maybe it's not a very high bar to pass, but I think the Capra Demon is among the best of these, and that's worth celebrating. The Capra Demon certainly throws a unique situation at you. The situation, which happens to frustrate the hell out of most players, is getting rushed and attacked right away without having enough time to respond. You'll get staggered by the Capra Demon or the dogs, they'll all gang up on you, and you might have a really hard time getting away from them without feeling like some luck was involved. But this is where trying to tackle the problem head-on is massively rewarded by the game. The whole premise of the fight, the entire thing that makes it difficult, you can just refuse to accept. You can tell the game to knock it off, not allowing getting rushed and stun-locked to even happen in the first place. And the game gives us a good variety of tools to make that possible. This isn't just like finding the Storm Ruler and having your one easy solution. Rather, the ways to make this fight easier are woven into the game more organically, and that's what's cool about it. First off, we have Poise. This is the most popular option in making the fight a lot easier. I made a video that explores the Poise mechanic in depth, but in short, it's what allows you to take hits without staggering, meaning that with enough Poise, you're a lot less likely to get stun-locked by the dogs. Bearing in mind that the central goal for most players is to first make it up the stairs in the back of the room, without Poise, that's a lot harder. With Poise, it doesn't feel like you need any luck, because who cares if you get hit by the dogs? It's probably not going to stop you from getting to safety. If you don't have a lot of heavier armor, a great option is to equip the Wolf Ring, which grants 40 Poise with no weight penalty. The dog's attacks drain 20 Poise, so there are two helpful breakpoints, 21 and 41. These amounts of Poise allow you to withstand either one hit from a dog or two hits. I find that being able to withstand just one dog attack without flinching is already a really big help. But what this means is that combining the Wolf Ring with any piece of armor that grants any amount of Poise, that will get you over 41, allowing you to tank 2 hits from a dog without flinching. This is a game changer. To anyone who ever complained about the fight feeling like you need to get lucky in the first 10 seconds, Poise changes the encounter entirely so that luck is no longer an element. Just ignore the dogs and pay attention to dodging only the Capra Demon's attacks, and you'll find that your original goal of getting up the stairs and/or killing the dogs first is vastly easier now. But what if you didn't know about Poise? It's not very fair for the game to punish you for not knowing about this one mechanic it didn't make a greater effort to explain without digging deeper into the menus, right? This is where the Capra Demon differs from a lot of other gimmick fights, because our goal of not getting stunlocked right away is something that's viable from a variety of mechanics. Next up, we have stealth. We could just not let the dog see us when we first enter the boss room, and we have two different options for this: equipping the Ring of Fog, or casting Hidden Body. Using either of these results in only the Capra Demon seeing you right away. Because of this, the Capra Demon rushing to join you by the fog gate while the dogs remain still creates a much larger opening to get around him and get up the stairs safely. Instead of feeling like you have to dodge the Capra Demon and both of the dogs simultaneously, you can easily take turns dealing with them. If you really wanted, you could use these items to stand your ground and just fight the Capra Demon by the fog gate and never bother with the stairs method. However, there's a few shortcomings with these stealth items that can make that a bit risky. While visual stealth is the more important thing here, auditory stealth plays a role in that the dog on the ground might hear you if you don't hug the fog gate properly.
What was that noise?
In which case it'll start approaching and eventually see you. To avoid this, you'd also want to consider casting Hush or equipping the Slumbering Dragoncrest ring. But now we're getting into the territory of having to kill an NPC to get these items early enough in your playthrough, so engaging in stealth at this level, while totally possible, is stretching the plausibility of being a viable strategy for the average player. I believe the best use of these items, once again, is in service of just getting up the stairs safely right away, just like Poise but for completely different build types. I should also stress that getting the visual stealth items relatively early is completely reasonable. Rescuing Dusk is how you unlock Hidden Body, something that's not difficult to do before heading to the lower Undead Burg. The Ring of Fog's availability in the early game is a bit more contentious. It's not at all impossible, but it is something that was a lot more reasonable closer to the game's release. But to explain all of that would involve going down a whole tangent, so I'm not going to bother. You can just pause the screen if you want to read my thoughts about getting the Ring of Fog before the Capra Demon. So lastly, we have Diversion. We can spam Oral Decoy, and none of the enemies will even be able to attack us. Admittedly, there are a few quirks to how this works that impact its viability, but it can be incredibly overpowered here. You'll want to cast Oral Decoy at a wall. It'll distract enemies for longer than if you cast it at the ground, because the moment enemies reach it, they'll lose aggro, and it being off of the ground means they can't fully reach it properly. But even if you didn't know this, casting it at the ground should be helpful enough. The biggest downside to me is how alluring skulls don't work here. This is what I hinted at the start of the video. If I could change just one thing about the Capra Demon fight, I'd make it so that alluring skulls attract the attention of dogs as well. This is probably the last thing that most players wish was different about the fight, but to me it's the biggest hiccup in allowing players to explore different mechanics here. If the player can think outside the box and try an alluring skull, I believe they should have been rewarded for it. The other strategies are also pretty great about being build flexible. Does heavy armor weigh you down too much to make Poise seem unattractive? Not a problem, just throw on the Wolf Ring. Are you not a spellcaster and therefore unable to cast Hidden Body? Just equip the Ring of Fog. By not allowing alluring skulls, we don't have a similar parallel here, and I think that's the weakest link in my defense about what makes this fight cool. That being said, no matter the situation, Oral Decoy is a lot more available than you might think. Even if you're not a spellcaster, we're off to a good start because half of the starting classes already have the stats needed to cast the spell. A knight would only have to level up once, a hunter or cleric would only need to level up twice, a warrior would only need to level up 3 times, and at most, a bandit would need to level up 4 times. This isn't some spell that's ever far out of your reach. And perhaps the best part is that, unlike most of the other strategies, it gives us an alternative to exploring the Darkroot Garden first. It's a spell sold by Griggs of Vinheim, who you find in the lower Undead Burg in the first place. This whole time, the level was trying to give you something to make the boss fight easier. And something that's worth stressing about all of these strategies is that none of them are mutually exclusive. We could stack Poise, Stealth, and Diversion to break this encounter beyond recognition. So at the end of the day, this fight is all about preparation. It's not a skill check, it's a brainstorming check. It's not about honing your dodge roll timings to be absolutely perfect, it's about recognizing a problem and seeing if you can figure out how to make the right choices before even walking through the fog gate. And maybe you'll still dislike the fight even on these merits, but the series clearly moved in a direction where challenging boss fights became a bigger focus, so you'll have a hard time convincing me that the Capra Demon doing something a bit different isn't really cool. Having a few boss fights to solve, rather than just being like a get good situation, is great, actually. But now, let's talk about cheese. Part of what motivated me to make this video in the first place is how overlooked these strategies often are. If someone expresses having difficulty with the Capra Demon, cheesing the fight by throwing fire bombs or dung pies from outside of the boss room is an incredibly popular recommendation. Now, I'm not here to try and gatekeep cheese tactics. Finding silly ways to break a game is something that can be very enjoyable in and of itself. There's no wrong way to play a video game if you're having fun. But when it comes to giving advice to other players online, where do we draw the line with that? If someone expressed having trouble with the gargoyles, how would we feel about someone dropping into the conversation by telling them how dupe glitches work, and recommending that they dupe soul items so that they can over-level before the fight? That's certainly an option, but maybe we should check in to see how much that player has leveled up their weapon first? Like maybe they haven't even just found the blacksmith yet, or maybe it would be a good time to check if they know how summoning works as well. Going straight to duping might rob that player of learning more about how the game works, and how they could clear the encounter without invoking extreme cheese. Sure, you could defeat the Capra Demon from outside the boss room, but this is often presented as a reasonable response to the fight being so supposedly unfair. Thankfully, recommending Poise is at least fairly common, but unfortunately, it's also not uncommon for neither Poise or any of the other strategies to be mentioned at all. So this leads to a situation where players commonly recommend getting up the stairs to use the environment to your advantage, but without mentioning any of the mechanics that make that orders of magnitude easier. This advice often fizzles out by saying that a lot of luck is involved to pull that off, so you might as well just cheese the fight because of how unfair it is. And I'm highly confident that this isn't just some imagined problem or confirmation bias on my behalf. I decided to take a look at a handful of Reddit threads from over the years where players were recommending tips on how to deal with the Capra Demon. I logged how often players mentioned using the stairs or killing the dogs first but nothing else, how often Poise, Stealth, or Diversion were recommended, and how often they recommended just cheesing the fight instead. Of course, these numbers aren't an exact science, and it's using a limited sample size, but I think it helps confirm the general ballpark of the discourse. Stealth and Diversion are a drop in the bucket, and in smaller threads that don't get dozens of replies, it's much more likely that they won't be mentioned at all, with the cheese method being almost 10 times more popular of a recommendation than using Stealth. And this is why I feel like the fight is so fundamentally misunderstood. It's a puzzle fight where the community usually doesn't explain your options for solving it, making it sound like it's some horrible thing if you don't cheese it. Of course, the most valid criticisms to me are issues with the camera. If this was a later Souls game, things like trees and maybe even the little columns on the side would likely become transparent if they got in front of the camera. So I don't want to take anything away from the players who've been saying that the camera sucked. From Software clearly agrees, as they've made an effort since then to fix the problem. But I do think this issue is greatly exacerbated when you're not tackling the central challenge of the fight head-on. You wouldn't be fighting with annoying camera angles if you weren't getting stun-locked into a corner in the first place, a problem for which the game gave you a whole bunch of options for preventing. But I think there's something to be said about where this fits into the broader concept of doing some problem-solving in these games, and there's still some room for disagreeing with me here and criticizing its implementation. The extent to which the difficulty of these games gets hyped sometimes has the unfortunate side effect of discouraging players from experimenting. These games are supposed to be hard, so that's just how it is, right? But in the same way you're not supposed to keep banging your head against the wall and die repeatedly to the Tree Sentinel of Elden Ring, it's up to the player to decide to not bother and just go around it. If listening to the multiple things telling you to go straight to Stormveil Castle causes a lot of trouble with Margit, the player is trusted to say, screw this, I'll come back later. While there are some players who don't mind perfecting fights at low levels, generally speaking, we're expected to figure out when to not accept challenges as they're initially presented to us in these games. You were always allowed to try sidestepping the main hurdle of the Capra fight, but to what extent is expecting players to experiment with mechanics in such a hands-off way fair? I think the variety of strategies available for the Capra Demon makes it not a particularly heinous offender, but understandably, some players will feel that the tutorial probably could have done a better job of introducing some of these concepts, rather than having to dig through menus to learn about Poise, or carefully reading item descriptions. Some players will feel like the Capra Demon fight sucks, in the context of the game not necessarily doing a good enough job of tutorializing some of these things, but I see that as a somewhat unpolished element of the tutorial itself, rather than the boss fight. That is, instead of complaining about the Capra Demon, if there's anything that needed to be improved, I believe that a more deserving element of our criticism would be some of the messaging from the start of the game. Because learning about these mechanics is helpful for the rest of the game as well, and the Capra fight is a great stopping point for reinforcing your understanding of them. That covers mostly everything I wanted to say. I didn't even really get into tangential stuff like boss runbacks, but you'd be surprised by the number of players who run into a wall in this fight without finding the path back to Firelink Shrine first. It's still a pretty long run back by the standards of later FromSoft games, but it's a lot easier and it comes with a pre-kindled bonfire. To me, this is just another element that speaks to how a good chunk of players get stuck here instead of exploring their options. It's a problem-solving boss, and if you don't engage with trying to solve what makes it hard, whether that's getting stun-locked right away or a run-back you find frustrating, I believe that's where almost all of the frustration comes from. I imagine that a pretty sizable portion of the community, if they were tasked with improving the Capra fight, they would elect to remove the dogs, give you a bigger arena to fight it in, and give the Capra a more challenging moveset, and before you know it, we just have another standard boss fight in a generic arena. The fact that it's not nearly as often viewed through the lens of a puzzle fight, and what changes could be made to tighten that aspect up, makes me feel that the Capra Demon is underappreciated for what it is. It's a pretty cool little boss fight. In my opinion, the most unfairly maligned in general discourse. And even if you still aren't on board, I sincerely hope I can at least diminish the talking point that the fight requires luck, and that is bullshit because of that. It never required luck, and anyone who ever said it did was wrong. Thanks so much for watching. I'd like to give a shout out to Critical Rants. Earlier this year, he also made a video defending the Capra Demon, and that's partially what prompted me to make this. The cool part is that he had mostly completely different reasons for praising it. So check that out if you're interested. You can find a link to his video in the video description. If you enjoyed this video, please consider doing all the usual things that help. You can also support me directly on Patreon. That's patreon.com/illusorywall. An extra special thanks to all of my backers at the Evil Vagrant tier. Basileus, Europa, Gary Marshall, Inciaratable, Jack Gerhart, Kakaruma, Carl Germ, Kiko Abad, Chris, Lazy Tangent, Matt, Nashwanazari, Nate Hines, Ronax, the Majalis Duo, and Zelther. Thank you all for watching, and have a great day.